early childhood, and I got to go with him one time. I was, I don't know, probably 8 or 9. I went with the middle school and some younger high school kids on a canoe trip. And his canoe trips were kind of legendary. If you want to get him talking for 17 to 24 hours straight, ask him about his canoe trips. And but I got to go on one, and I was, and that was every night. You know, he would have, they called it P&P, prayer and praise, and that was one of those songs that, if they could pack a guitar, they would pack a guitar, and one of the kids or one of the leaders would kind of strum along, and that was one of the songs that, even at 8, 9 years old or whatever, that was just one of my favorites. So thank you for choosing that one. That was that was great. So I had some pretty awesome, very awesome things happen personally this week, and I have a little bit of ADHD where I'll be focused on something, and then something else will happen, and then I want to completely change. So I almost completely changed this sermon on Thursday because of, and again, it'll be something I will get into at some point. It's part of my 78-part series on, my life and, issues. But very, very couldn't be better news. And so it'll be more on God's timing, but Romans 3 is such a holy cow. I think I gave myself about half a dozen migraines trying to get through Romans 3 and really get into it. And that was kind of why I wanted to do this. When, of course, we knew a month or so ago, that Pastor Sam was going to be gone. We knew that Rod was going to fill in one of the 2 Sundays. I was going to fill in the other Sunday. We didn't know which one, kind of depending on Rod's work schedule. And didn't know that if Rod was going to, continue on in the series that he did, of course, or if he was going to continue this study on Romans 3. So about a month ago, when I knew we were going to be going through Romans, I kind of cheated and went ahead, and I read Romans 3, and there's a big part of me that was like, oh man, I really hope Rod takes Romans 3. But then, kind of that, like the competitiveness, and I like being challenged. I like it when people say I'm too old to do things, or, that you can't do this, you can't do that. That's more the stubbornness kind of pops out and it's like, oh, all right, I will do it then. And so I'm really pumped about Romans 3, and because it's like anything in Romans especially, there's just a lot of really good stuff. Of course, we know towards the end of Romans 3, we have one of those, call them cornerstone verses, one of those verses that everybody knows from the earliest of times. Atheists know it, non-believers know it. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's just one of those verses that everybody knows. It's kind of like John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you. Mark 5:11, there's a large herd of pigs feeding on the nearby hillside. Those verses that everybody kind of knows. Mark 5:11 is more of a family thing, because we were usually a large herd of pigs. And Romans 3:23, just on its own, we could spend the next half hour, 45 minutes, to a week just talking on that. But we need to get there first, and we need to kind of wrap up. Paul really kind of wraps up the beginning of Romans, as we've talked a lot about sin, right? The first, after the introduction in chapter 1, and then through through chapter 1 through chapter 2, we talk a lot about sin and the law and judgment and a lot of those things. And chapter 3 kind of wraps that up. And then towards the middle of the chapter, and as we get into the end, it really is kind of one of those, kind of the heart of Romans. This first 8 verses of Romans, I don't know if anybody's ever read them or not. They might be among the more difficult sections to read. And maybe that's just the way that the English language, how it's been translated. It's just really hard, or at least, and maybe I'm just talking for myself. If you're one of those blessed ones that it just makes sense to you, thank you, and we should have talked earlier this week. So I'm going to read it, and then we're going to go through it and kind of, because a lot of this, once I kind of made a couple of realizations, it made more sense. So we're going to read just the first 8 verses of Romans chapter 3. Verse 1. Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though every one were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. And this is where my head starts to spin. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means. For then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come? As some people slanderously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just. I probably read that passage, those 8 verses, 100 times this week. And every time, my headache kind of grew a little bit. Until I realized, and of course I'm blessed to have a lot of, aids, study aids, books, these big, giant, exegetical, commentaries that people far smarter than me that break down verse by verse these verses. And I have that, and I have Google. Praise the Lord for Google some days. Oh, we were just literally talking about that, how a resource that is. And it finally dawned on me that this is Paul having a hypothetical argument with a Jewish person in his head. Anybody else have these hypothetical arguments in their head? I do this all the time with my boys, with my ball players. In my head, I have Billy Bob comes to me and says, Coach, why am I not playing? And then I argue back with him why he's not playing. I have had a million arguments with my wife, and I've won every single one of them in my head. Also not even close to being married. But I have had those arguments. And so, once I realized that this is Paul having a two-sided argument with himself, basically, in this letter form, then it started to click for me. So I kind of typed it out, based on the aids that I had and kind of my own things. So really it's more verse 1 where it says, then what advantage has the Jew, or what is the value of circumcision? This is Paul saying, is there a saving advantage to being a Jew rather than a Gentile? Is it better to be a Jew than a Gentile? And then Paul answers, well, there's a lot of advantage to being a Jew. They were given the scriptures, and those scriptures promises the future salvation, which we know as Jesus Christ. Verse 3 basically says, if some were unfaithful, does that cancel God's promise of salvation? Okay, if somebody's a sinner, does that cancel out God's forgiveness? Absolutely not. God's words are just as true. Jews are just as much sinners as Gentiles are, but God's words being true also includes his judgment of righteousness. God will triumph and be right in his judging of people in their sin. In verse 5, my struggle one, where it says, but if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? And this is basically the Jew in his arguing. This is the Jews just saying, if they are so unrighteous that they can't do anything apart from God's grace, then God would be unrighteous in sending his wrath against them, right? If we're far away from God, then God's unrighteous by judging us. And Paul's replies, well, if you're right, then God can't possibly judge the Gentiles because we are the Gentiles. We didn't have the Gentiles of that day. We have it now. The Gentiles of that day were not following the Mosaic law, right? They didn't have the law. They were Gentiles. And then verse 7 is kind of another, the Jewish reply is kind of the same as in verse 5. If our sin is bad, and this is kind of the gist of where it kind of gives the gist of this whole argument. If our sin is bad and that creates more glory for God, why does God condemn us as sinners? If we do bad things and that gives God, and God is giving us more glory, to wipe out those sins, why aren't we sinning more? Kind of a weird but you can see the argument a little bit. And then Paul's answer to that is saying we should practice evil in order to bring out a greater good. God's glory would be revealed even greater. That's kind of what the Jew is saying. And Paul's answer is that if somebody thinks that doing evil brings about greater good from God, their punishment is right and just. That's basically a better understanding of, or for me, a better understanding of this first part. We don't sin to bring about the glory of God, right? That's kind of the gist of that section. Don't sin just to bring God's glory. Go search for God's going to glorify you, period, right? Like, you don't need to sin to bring God's glory. He did that already with Jesus Christ. Okay, let's go into the next section where we kind of get into nobody is righteous. That's the headline in my book. And so through the first two and a half chapters now, Paul is explaining that sin explains why the promises to Abraham have not been fulfilled. They have become a reality because Jews are still slaves to sin just as much as Gentiles are. The failure to glorify and honor God is not just a Gentile problem, it's universal. Okay? Sin is universal. It's not just a Gentile thing, it's not just a Jewish thing. We all sin, as obviously we get into here in 15 verses or so. So, reading in chapter 9 of Romans 3. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, or Gentiles, are under sin. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have sinned, all have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There's no fear of God before their eyes. Paul uses a bunch of different, those are just a bunch of different quotations from the Old Testament, a lot from Psalms, Isaiah, and Jeremiah that he uses in there, basically to say we've all sinned. There's not one person in here, or raise your hand, I guess, if every word out of your mouth has been true, right, and glorifying to God. There's not going to be a single person in the history of the world that has ever, well, one, but he's obviously a little different. So this is just kind of the beginning to introduce this concept of we have all sinned, okay? Because not one of us can check off any of those boxes that we have not done, correct? We've had days where we haven't walked with God. We've had days where our mouths have gotten us into trouble, right? We have days that our thoughts are not pure, right? And so, excuse me. So we kind of wrap it all kind of up here in verses 19 and 20, this first two and a half chapters. Verse 19, now we know that whenever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. And this is just talking to Jews that are still living under the Mosaic law, but then it gets into everybody. The whole world will be held accountable to God. Now, the Jews, of course, are under this Mosaic law, the law of Moses, and that is still how they continue to this day under that law, still following the 512 or however many laws there are in Deuteronomy. We now live in what we believe in the Messianic age, in the Messianic era, the new covenant of Jesus Christ, where Jesus Christ is this new covenant that God gave to us, his people, right? And then in verse 20, for by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. And this is a fascinating idea of Gentiles don't have the law. We did not have Deuteronomy and Exodus and the Ten Commandments. But we have the law of, where does it say it? consciousness. We know not to murder. We know rape's bad. We know not to steal. Did we need God to tell us that? Not necessarily. We just know that. That's just, kind of one of those common knowledge. Like, you don't beat that kid up, But then we have this idea that once we got the 10 Commandments, or once the Jews got the 10 Commandments, now we know what sin is, and now it's easier to sin because we know what sin is. And then we get into the good stuff. And this section, of course, this has that famous verse in it. Verses 21 through 26, a 5-verse paragraph. And up until this point, Paul has argued that everybody deserves God's wrath and judgment, right? He's pretty harsh in some of his language and the way he writes and he talks to the readers, including us. He's pretty harsh in the first, 2.5 chapters of Romans. Like, he doesn't hold any punches. Sin is bad, God's judgment is coming upon you, right? Like, if we can kind of narrow all of that early part of Romans down to, sin is bad, God doesn't like sin, don't do it. But then we just kind of change that argument a little bit, in a good way. Verse 21. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law. And that's the key word, apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God, this is Jesus Christ. This is the separation from the law, apart from the law. That's why I say that's the key point. Jesus is apart from the law, and the law and the prophets bear witness to Jesus Christ. We talked about it in Sunday school today, how all of these Old Testament prophecies point to Jesus Christ, right? Like I mentioned it in Sunday school. How often do you just go back and read Jeremiah or Isaiah? I do this all the time. And I'm reading through it and I'm like, oh, that's talking about Jesus in 1,000 years. Oh, that's Jesus. Oh, that's going to be Jesus. And it's almost kind of like a little treasure map almost. Like, oh, hey, that's going to be Jesus. I know that guy. And so Paul's changing his argument a little bit now that the law and the prophets bear witness to Jesus Christ. Verse 22, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe, for there is no distinction. We're going to finish that off in a second. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. We get God's glory and God's grace by believing in Jesus Christ. It's that simple. And that's one of those verses that doesn't wipe away the law, it just replaces the law. We don't have to follow, that's why we eat pork. I'm going to have bacon here in about 20 minutes, right? We don't follow that because we have this new law, the new righteousness of God through Jesus Christ, if we believe in him. And then it gets into our favorite one, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And this is, to me, maybe the most comforting verse in the whole Bible. For all have sinned. You have sinned. You have sinned. You have sinned. You have sinned. I have sinned. None of us, we're all on the same page. Right? All of us have sinned. None of us are worthy of God and God the Father and Jesus Christ. None of us are worthy of that. But he brought Jesus down here to take away that sin and to give us kind of an out, if you want to take it that way. Jesus took our sins so that we don't have to be under the umbrella of those sins. I don't have to worry about the sins that I did when I was 14. God's taken care of that. Have I gotten better? Yes, I have. Most days. We'll see tomorrow when the snow's flying. Verse 24. And this is one of my other things. Like, go back and read like John 3:16, but read the verses before it and the verses after it. They're just as good. as John 3:16. You know what I mean? Like they're just like John 3:16 is like the superstar verse, but John 3:15, fantastic. And same thing with, the verses before and after verse 23 here. So verse 24, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. So you read that all together. I'm going to read the end of 22 through 24. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. We have sinned. Jesus took care of it. We're saved. Pretty easy. I kind of wish I would have hung out with Paul back in the day and said, hey, we can clean this, we can chop this down to about, 4 verses. But it's kind of like Sam, when he has his hour and a half long message. Hey, we could turn this into, 10. But I get to pick on him because I get to. And he's not here. And whether he listens to this or not, I don't know. In verse 25, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. This is just continuing that idea. Paul goes from being really harsh and, condemning in a way, and, speaking of the wrath of God about sin, to now being like, hey, but here's your out. Follow Jesus. Believe in Jesus. Love Jesus. Because you do all those things, you're not going to sin. How many times have you sinned when you're, praising Jesus? Pretty easy to not sin when you're praising Jesus. When you stop praising Jesus, then, we start, trickling back to, worrying about baseball practice, or worrying about this, or worrying about that. We have Jesus. All right, finish it off here, verses 27 through 31. Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also. Since God is one, who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith? Do we then overthrow the law by his faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. This is pretty powerful stuff in the early church, because there's a lot of infighting. There's a lot of Jewish Christians, Jews that had converted early on into Christianity, that were not a big fan of allowing Greeks and Romans and Gentiles into the faith. And that's why Paul is writing this to the Jews in Rome, and to be read aloud and to be read and spread through the Gentile world. Because he says it, and this is the beginning of the always fun argument, are we justified by our works? Or are we justified by our faith? And it's said over and over again, we are justified by faith and faith alone. What that also means, though, is that through our faith, if we are following our faith the way we should be following our faith, we are going to do the good works, right? We are going to support the poor. We're going to take care of the children. We are going to do that if we are in our faith. Now, if we just go give money to the poor, that's not getting us into heaven. We just do that to, buy our way, if you will, into heaven. That's not how that works. And Paul's very clear with that right there in that passage. It's not by works. And of course, in his later writings, it is not by works that we get into heaven. It's by faith. But faith leads to the good works. And this faith is open to all of us. So it's kind of, Paul is writing to the Jews and explaining to the Jews, hey, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing this right. But this is also for the Gentiles to be following and doing the same things. But he has to kind of straighten out the Jews in the first place. As we've learned in Acts, God calls for Jesus says to spread the word first in Jerusalem, then in Judea and Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. We're kind of in that, towards the end of that. But he has to take care of the Jews first. And with that, he's also speaking to us, the Gentiles. So while I look at this and I've given myself so many headaches over it, it really just comes down to just believe in Jesus. And that's really what the whole, every single sermon just comes down to that, right? Just believe in Jesus. Follow Jesus. Then you're going to do the right thing. You're going to do the right thing. Your works, and then your works justify, and your works will then help build your faith, right? How many times I don't know if you've gone and served at like a soup kitchen. I used to go help out, with at the cafeteria at the schools. And just the kids' faces lighting up when you hand them a cookie. Just something like that. It makes you feel good. It kind of brings you do that in conjunction with your faith. You're setting yourself up pretty good. And you're going to strengthen your faith. Okay, we're going to pray, and then we're going to do communion. I have a couple things to pray for. Anybody have anything that they want